folks. So, we're all able to figure that out? I hope so. Okay. Definitely need to figure that out before we move on to the topic of muscle contraction, which is the next whole series of lectures. But let's just go ahead and finish this one out about muscle tissue. And we're going to back away from all this microscopic work, and we're going to look at structures and shapes and attachments of the muscle, things that you can see with gross anatomy, and kind of relate them to function a little bit. So when we look at muscles, they are attached to bone, okay? And we've talked about how they're attached through tendons, okay? And that's how most of our skeletal muscles are going to be attached, where there's this gap between the end of the muscle and where the bone is. And in most places, that's going to be with a tendon, something that's narrow and goes down to a focal point. Some parts in the body, this is going to be quite broad, like in the abdominal wall muscles, where we have a broad sheet-like tendon known as an aponeurosis. Both of those are examples of indirect attachment because the muscle is not attaching directly to the bone. So then we have the direct attachments, which are much more rare. And what happens here is there's only a very small, very short amount of collagen fibers separating the muscle tissue from the bony tissue. Okay. Now, in addition to this, there's also a structure known as a retinaculum, which you'll learn about when you learn the structures in your extremity. And what a retinaculum is, it's a band of dense connective tissue. So we have a lot of collagen fibers. And in some locations where we have this retinaculum, you're going to have a bunch of these tendons for indirect attachment passing underneath of these, so that when that joint flexes, for instance, we wouldn't, well, let me just do it here. If we had a retinaculum here on this side of the wrist, which we do, if you normally would have a tendon like this without a retinaculum, when you flexed, do you see what would happen? The tendon would stick out. But because of the retinaculum, the tendon is stuck in normal place. So those are examples of structures we're going to see more of in lab to help you identify specific muscles. So looking at skeletal muscle attachments, what you have to realize is when it's moving, no matter what type of movement, the whole point is to move the insertion closer to the origin of the muscles. Now, some textbooks are just calling it two attachments, but a lot of people still believe in the origin and the insertion, where the origin is the more fixed, or known as the head of the muscle. Now, in this particular piece, I took this picture because it has two muscles that you don't know the names of. Neither of these are your biceps muscle. Okay? And what you have to do when you look at the muscle, you have to determine, for instance, this one is going from the scapula to the humerus. What part of your body is more mobile, your humerus or your scapula? Yeah, your humerus. So that you could definitely see on this skinnier little muscle that this would have to be the origin. And it's the same thing between your humerus and your forearm. Your forearm is even more mobile than your arm. So both of those ends would be the more fixed, so that would be the origin, which means the distal end is going to move closer. All right. So for these two, it just happened to be that the origins were proximal or superior, but that's not how it always is, okay? In your neck, this very powerful thick muscle right here, the head is here on your chest and the insertion is on your head, because your head definitely moves a lot more than your chest does, okay? So you just need to stop and think about every muscle, like which part is being moved, and then you can figure out where the origin and the insertion is, and then you're halfway to figuring out the action without having to memorize a table. So most muscle movement is due to a group of muscles working together. If you're going into kinesiology or into physical therapy, you will learn for certain movements that there's like, well, when the arm is in this position, this is the one that does most of the work, and we call that the prime mover, okay? For us, in this course, is an introductory course. We're not gonna learn what the prime mover is, but textbooks still use the word. But all the muscles that are moving that are called agonists. For instance, in flexing your elbow, okay, all of you know that the biceps brachii muscle flexes your elbow. You would say flex the arm, but it doesn't flex your shoulder. This is your arm, so it's flexing your forearm. So it's flexing your elbow. Okay. And you would probably think it's the prime mover, but it's not. Okay. However, it is an agonist. It does elbow flexion. Now, muscles that would oppose that, so muscles that all do that together. So the prime mover is a muscle called the brachialis, which was on a previous picture. And so both of those would be agonists, or we would use the word synergist, meaning they all work together for this action. And then muscles that would oppose that would be called antagonists. For instance, your triceps muscle back here, when it contracts, it is going to straighten or extend your elbow. So flexion and extension are opposite movements. So if you're talking about flexion, the flexors are the synergists and the extensors are the antagonists. If you're talking about elbow extension, then the extensors are the synergists and the flexors are the antagonists. Okay, so I hope you understood that. So this picture is showing your thigh muscles. Anteriorly, you have your quadriceps muscles. Posteriorly, you have your hamstrings. If we are talking actions related to the quadriceps, those would be the synergists, and then the hamstrings would be the antagonists. Okay, so it works the same way everywhere in your body. So as you're learning actions, be prepared for being asked what's a synergist or what's an antagonist of this one. All right. So when we come naming skeletal muscles, I know at first glance they look like they make no sense, but they actually make a lot of sense. One choice of wordage also always relates to size. For instance, in your buttocks, we actually have 3 different size muscles. So we have like a papa bear, a mama bear, and a baby bear. And so they're called the gluteus maximus, medius, and minimus. Another example would be for shape. So if you look on the left, they look kind of like a parallelogram. You remember that from geometry? If you take a rectangle, put it on its angle, it's called parallelogram. And then rectangles, parallelograms, squares, those are all examples of that 4-sided group known as rhomboids. So these would be rhomboids. Here we have a big one and a little one. So we're also going to deal with size. We're going to call it a rhomboid major and a rhomboid minor. The one in the middle looks like the zigzag of a serrated knife. And this is in the anterior chest. So we're going to call it the serratus anterior. We have a similar muscle on the posterior chest wall called the serratus posterior. A third example has to do with location. So a muscle overlying your temporal bone would be called the temporalis. Here we had a frontalis. Back here we have an occipitalis. Over the subscapular fossa, we would have a subscapularis. So the word is telling you where it is, so you don't have to learn where it is. Another example is muscle names can tell us fiber directions. For instance, the word oblique means it's going at an angle, and we have external obliques, meaning they're closer to the surface, and internal meaning they're closer, they're deep. If it's transverse, that's telling you it's going in a transverse plane. Sometimes the name tells you the attachments. For instance, this muscle, do you see how it goes anterior to the tibia? So it's called, the tibialis anterior. I know, it's not so difficult at times. And then this last example has to do with number of origins. So if a muscle has 2 origins or 2 heads, it's called a biceps. If it has 3, it's called a triceps. And so what's a quadriceps? It's actually not a muscle with 4 heads, it's actually 4 muscles that work together. Okay. And then sometimes the muscle name actually gives you the action. For instance, this one, between your scapula and your cervical spine, the transverse process of your cervical spine, which one do you think is more mobile? I think maybe your scapula. So this muscle moves the scapula in an upward direction. If you recall, that is elevation. So it elevates the scapula, and the name of that is the levator scapulae. All right. So let's now talk about muscle shapes. And by muscle shapes, we're talking how are the fascicles arranged. Sometimes they're arranged in a circle around an opening, for instance, around your mouth, around your eye. Okay, so those are going to be circular muscles. Sometimes the muscle fibers are parallel, and that forms a parallel muscle. These are ones that tend to be very long. Okay, and so they're very long, so they can have a significant shortening. Other times in a two-dimensional plane, the muscle fibers will converge to a narrow little tendon, like for instance with your pectoralis muscles, and that would be a convergent muscle. Over here on the far right, this is a parallel muscle, but it's not exactly the same thickness all the way through. It starts out and then it actually gets fatter in the middle, and then it gets back to its resting width. And so that's called a fusiform shape. Then we have muscles that look like feathers, okay? And the reason they look like feathers is because how their tendons are attached. So in the first one, we have a tendon on one side, and what you can see is all the muscle fibers are coming in an angle, and there's no muscle fibers on the other side. So that's called unipennant. In a bipennant muscles, we're going to have muscles coming in at an angle on both sides of the tendon. And a multipennant, if you look at this picture, do you see how multipennant looks exactly like convergent in the picture? And that's because you're looking at a 2D picture. But let's recall what I said about a convergent muscle. I said it is a 2D muscle converging. Okay. Whereas a multipennant muscle goes around a curve in 3D and converges in one area. So with that, you don't need to know these muscle names, but go ahead and go through these, pause the picture, use those same 7 terms, and figure out the 7 shapes which are shown here. Okay, so if you had any problem with that, send me an email. So the next concept, and the reason why you really need to understand those fascicle shapes and those muscle shapes, is because they help you predict power and range of motion. So super important for all you PT, kinesiology, occupational therapy, all those kinds of people. Power depends if you had a square, like for instance, a rectangle, okay? The total cross section. So for instance, if this was a parallel muscle, all the muscle fibers would be in this direction. Whereas if this was unipennant, all the muscle fibers would go in this direction. So can you see how you would have more muscle fibers if this was a unipennant than if this is a parallel? Yeah. So the more muscle fibers you have contracting, the more power you're going to get. Okay, the thicker it is, the more power. More cells contracting gives you more strength. In contrast to that, range of motion depends on the length of the fibers. Remember, the unipennants, they were short. Okay. Parallel, they are long. Okay, I can make parallel like this and it would just go like that. But parallel, they are long, which means they have more length they can contract. This only has this amount of length. This one has more than twice the amount of length. Each fiber can shorten up to 70% of its length. So if a fiber like this shortens 70%, okay, that means it would still, it could get to as short as this. But if a fiber like this, it wouldn't even have to, it wouldn't even have to contract 70% of its length, and it would still have a bigger decrease in length. So ballet dancers, yoga, range of motion is what you're using. Gymnastics. Okay, gymnastics is also using some power, but of other muscle groups. Okay, So the last concept has to do with muscle contraction. It's like kind of like at the swimming pool, no pushing. Bones don't move by pushing them away. And I know you're saying, but Dr. Powell, I can push a cart. You are pushing the cart because you are contracting these muscles. They are getting shorter, and you're contracting leg muscles as you are walking. So everything has to do with muscle contraction for bone movement, not for muscle lengthening. Okay, so that's the end of this whole first lecture series for this next lecture test, which is going to be a lot about muscles. So make up your study schedule and kind of stick to it. You can do this stuff, but if you get far behind, it becomes really hard. So make sure you understand all this before you go into the second series, which all has to do about muscle contraction. You really need to know the answers to those 2 sets of questions I gave you and really know that microanatomy. And with that, I want to thank you for all your hard work. We are going to stop with this section and have a good day.